Welcome to the Lightbulb Moment podcast. You are listening to episode 40, Design Considerations for Live Online Learning. In this episode, challenges for designing, considerations and mindset, designing for your needs, and tips from how we approach our sessions here at Lightbulb Moment. Welcome everyone, I hope you're all keeping well and safe. Today we're talking about this dramatic cultural shift, whether it's L&D departments or, freelance trainers, universities, whatever it is, where people have had to jump into virtual classrooms and live online learning. Now, there's been a lot of stress and anxiety caused by this, Jo. Let's get into this. What are we going to be talking about amongst this today?
Well, it's those people that say, I normally run an all-day training session. Should I do the same live online? Or our lectures are 3 hours long. We've got 200 attendees in our university campuses. Can I do that online? And all sorts of variations on those questions. And people are going through this dilemma right now, aren't they, Mike?
Yeah, for sure. Exactly like you say, sort of self-employed trainers trying to work out that they normally go to an organisation or whatever it is for an all-day training workshop. And now they're trying to get round in their head. We've got people posting on our community, can I do this? Normally I literally go, set up camp, train everyone all day. Should I do this? Can I do this? Is it the right thing to do? Everyone has got these questions right now.
Absolutely. And then from the further and higher education point of view, there was the emergency back in kind of March, April, May, but now they're looking at their autumn term or semester. It's like, well, how do we do this in this not even quite post-COVID world?
Yeah, exactly. What is it everyone says in the world of change or uncertainty at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, the new normal is a statement people are hating, but kind of is the reality.
Yeah, exactly. So in which case, what can we do to basically try and resolve these questions, these challenges, and help our listeners today?
Well, I'm not sure we can resolve all of these issues today in one podcast, Mike, but let's go over some points we need to be thinking about, what could work for different people in different situations, and pros and cons, and hopefully provide all of you guys out there with some food for thought.
Okay, you saved it. I was just about to say, in our intro, you say you can't actually resolve this question. I was like, let's just stop the podcast.
Yeah, everybody just presses stop right now, moves on to a whole other podcast.
Exactly. Okay, so that's perfect. It does sound like, exactly like you've said, looking at those challenges. So, where do we start? Where's the first part we should be looking at this?
Okay, so I often start my training sessions by first looking at some of the challenges before tackling the opportunities. And that seems as good a place as any today. So let's understand them, and then we're in a better place to overcome them. So
this is kind of what we've just alluded to. Lots of people saying to us, we've got all-day training sessions, or I run, a 3-day workshop. How can I do this online? That's what we're hearing a lot of right now.
Absolutely. And that's a big one. How long should a live online training or learning session be? And there's no answer to that. So is this another one of those stop the podcast now? What we can do is talk through the issues and make some suggestions of what might work best in different situations.
Where can we start to help?
Okay, so what we really need to look at is what the questions really are. So take the example of that all-day training session, and that can be equated to whatever the length of your session is. What we've got is the real questions are, can I deliver for that amount of time live online? Do I have the energy? Is there the technology that enables it? Do we have the resources? And that could be the digital resources, but it could be the people. Have we planned it? Do we understand the platform we're delivering with? So there's a whole load of questions, and I haven't even started, Mike. We've also got the participants, and think about our learners. Will they get tired or bored? Can they use that technology? Do they have access to it all day if that's what you want to do? Does the training material work online all day? Does it need a complete redesign? Will it then work in a long session? I mean, I could go on if you wanted me to, Mike.
Yeah, that is quite a bit to digest there, Jo. And I guess a lot of those questions then impact the other points or the other questions that you've then mentioned there. And I guess lastly, often training sessions are all day because of the cost of getting people to the venue, both travel costs and the effort of that. Live online, we don't have those worries, so we don't have maybe that necessity to cram everything into an all-day session. And maybe it'd be better for the learning to split it into separate sections or sessions.
A lot better for the learning, because I always joke it's that Homer Simpson issue of, if you put one more thing in my brain, something's going to fall out. Whereas if we split those sessions up, there's less chance of that happening. We retain more, which is really good.
Yeah, and so let's start with that energy level point, from yourself and the attendee, as you mentioned it in both of those points just a second ago. Now, we hear time and time again from people, basically they say, it's so tiring when I have to deliver live online. It takes more effort and energy to keep up with the facilitation, bring the attendees along with you. That's something we hear. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's really common to say that, and understandably, because what we're doing is we're focusing on things in a different way. We're used to face-to-face, scanning the room, all those things we've learned and honed over 5 or 10 years of training or whatever. And we're having to relearn it and do extra stuff live online. Obviously, it gets easier with experience, but it takes a bit more energy, I think, to do it live online.
I guess effectively your brain is working in overdrive, and you're also trying to teach yourself these new things as well. So it's a double whammy for the facilitator. Yeah,
it certainly is in the first few weeks, months, maybe a year or more, depending on how many sessions you're delivering. As I say, it gets easier. The first few sessions I did, literally, I just went and laid down afterwards and went to sleep. But now I'm doing it much more often. It's more like I feel pumped afterwards and I want more. I've succumbed to the live online learning drug.
And what other considerations are there that we should be thinking about?
I think a big one is that we are so used to delivering our content face-to-face, and we use the physical body language that we interpret to help us deliver. And when we're live online, it can feel like we've lost a huge range of the skills that we normally utilise. And this can then put us out of our comfort zone, which then obviously tires us out more.
Yeah, for sure. I guess you're out of your comfort zone. Your brain is trying to work on overdrive to compensate for the different environment, and it's just going to tire you out. And also, I guess it can tire out the attendees. Also, we're seeing a lot of things about, Zoom fatigue or live online fatigue, things like this. We've got to think about the attendees as well.
Absolutely. I mean, who wants to be on a 4-hour, webinar with no interaction, have a quick lunch, and then another 4-hour webinar? Or you could substitute meetings for that. It's going to drain your energy, just like it will do in any situation like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. But hopefully what we're talking about here, and if our listeners have listened to any of our other podcasts, we're trying to talk about an interactive training session, though, not a lecture webinar kind of thing.
Yeah. And this is always, I'm going to kind of go off at a slight tangent here, and I know you hate me for doing this, but I think, I use that term lecture and say we don't want a lecture webinar myself, but we have to be really careful, because lectures face-to-face can be amazing. They can be engaging, they can be inspiring, and absolutely awesome. But that's because people have honed their skills, in the delivery and the presentation, but also the reading of their audience that are with them. And when you don't have the skill to be able to do that live online, which I think we'll probably get to talking about a bit more, that's where the lecture becomes a poor quality webinar with no interaction. And this is where really good design comes in. You have these all-day sessions, but actually they need to be designed extremely well. So if you did do all day online, which you can do, you need so many different type of activities, and there's research to say that the more different type of activities you have, A, the better the learning is perceived, and B, the better the satisfaction is. You need people to be social, you need breakout rooms, reflection time, breaks, and this is all best practice we know as trainers, but it's even more important live online.
Yeah, and I guess when we're talking about potentially converting these sort of all-day workshops, we keep using that term all-day session, but this also equates to, maybe it's just you've got a whole morning. Normally you would have your sales team for the whole morning, so now you're planning on doing a 9 till 1 session in the morning, that can still equate to this all-day question of what we're going over now is, should I do that 4-hour session? Should I do 2 3-hour sessions in the same day, for example?
Should I even do an hour session online? Is that appropriate? And you bring up sales as an example. We've tried to run some training sessions for a client of ours for their sales team, and 2 of them or 3 of them, whatever it is, have basically been cancelled last minute because sales have been busy doing other things. So you have to respect what their day-to-day performance needs are. So, you then have to ask, well, is a 2-hour live online learning session the most appropriate way for people to get these skills? So that's a bigger question, but it kind of goes into that.
Yeah, it's just what I'm thinking, going back to this, what we've been talking about, this all-day session, or let's say a very long session that you might be planning to run. I guess one of the things that, if I could try and be bold and unanswer an element of this question, if I can.
Yeah, you go ahead, Mike. You give it a try.
Well, I think being honest, and what I'm saying here is for our listeners to be honest and sort of ask yourself the question, do you actually currently have the skills within yourself or within your organization to develop, design and write an all-day session or a 4-hour session or whatever it's going to be that includes everything you just spoke about, Joe? The social interaction, the multiple varied activities, lots of interaction points, having engagement, breakouts, discussions, and so on. Because if you can't, or if that just seems like a massive mountain to climb, we've answered the question of you probably shouldn't do an all-day session, surely.
Yeah, well, what do you think, Mike? I mean, you produce sessions rather than facilitate to kind of divide those skills. What is it that you've observed?
Well, I think the reason I have this for, or that point of what I've just made, and I think a common thing we hear from L&D managers or even just facilitators on the ground floor in organisations that we speak to, they say that they've got amazing face-to-face facilitators, or they have so much confidence in their own face-to-face delivery, but then they go online and they almost just go back 10 years in their career. They're getting all the basics wrong. They're going into one-way communication. They drop loads of activities and reflection points. Things that they would normally do face-to-face, they stop doing.
Been there, done that. and that experience.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to get to here is, if you feel you might do this, or you're already doing this in your live online sessions, if you can have that sort of self-reflection and go, actually, I'm doing, half of what I would normally do face-to-face, or I don't feel comfortable that I'm really getting the learning point across like I would do in a face-to-face session, then trying to run an all-day training session or an all-morning session, it might just be you're asking too much, do you think?
Yeah, and that can be a lack of faith in the technology. It could be a lack of faith in yourself, your own skills, or it's just different, and you don't know how to do it, and you thought it would be okay, and you've had a different experience. There could be so many reasons for that, but I think you've hit on those major points there. You can run live online learning sessions all day, but there's going to be a huge amount of work that needs to be put into that, because those all-day sessions need to be designed from the ground up to work live online. And let's think about, I do a lot of design work. On a really good day where I know my topic, I average about 8 hours to design 1 hour of what I'm going to deliver. So 8 hours of design work for 1 hour of delivery. Now, depending on the type of session, it could be much longer. And if I'm working with a client on their session design, I would easily double that.
Wow. I mean, that's really interesting in itself. And if we think about sort of an all-day training session, that's potentially 64 hours to design your all-day training sessions. Or like, as you've just mentioned, potentially if you're working with an external client, if you double, that's 128 hours to design it for the client. And this is based on your knowledge of the platform, which is obviously excellent and expert.
Why, thank you.
And having a working knowledge of running loads of different activities and types of activities. You've got that working knowledge of going, well, I'll do this, I'll do that. If you potentially don't have that, that could be even harder. Yeah,
and it would take longer. And this is the thing we often say to people is, is obviously when you learn anything new, it takes longer at the beginning. So that 1 hour that I spend, it might be 2 or 3 or 4 hours that you've spent. But once you get going, once you know your platform and all of, you've got a few repertoire of, this type of activity will work here, that obviously gets shorter. But and also it's to do with, I think, like with any session, whether it's face-to-face or live online, if it's going to be all-day sessions, for it to work well, it has to be for the learning need and for the participants. And probably that's not right for live online. I'd say 90% of cases, it's not right and break the session up.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess let's quickly touch on some other points as well, because we've spent a bit of time on this one. You said, what if your attendees can't have access to the technology for that length of time? I mean, is that just quite an obvious point? They either can use it or they can't?
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, it might be easy for us to think, right, we've all got a computer at our desk. We can set aside a whole day, a half day, whatever, that'll be fine. But actually, in so many organisations, people desk share, even as an example. Students might be in a library, or if you're working from home, you might be sharing a laptop with your siblings or your parents. We've heard from our clients where they've got maybe 6 attendees huddled around an iPad, for instance. It's always something that should be considered, especially in this time of change and uncertainty that we find ourselves in now. And there's a lot of research coming out now from different places, and you can go and Google it, that so many industries can't or don't work from home. A lot of people are making this assumption, and we shouldn't.
Yeah, that's a really good and valid point that you've made there. And I think this conversation, especially with that, how much time it takes to design, and that's sort of 64 hours of design for your all-day session. I mean, that might be enough for our listeners to think, well, actually, maybe I won't just try and convert my whole training session.
Are we just making people just go, I'm just going to wait for face-to-face to come back?
Well, hopefully not.
Kind of not what we meant to do, really.
If that's the case, I think we failed on this podcast. But I guess what this leads us to is, if it's going to take that long to do that design, then we need to really consider that design and what we want for it, isn't it?
So we're thinking about attendees, how long for the session, type of content, that kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
That's what I'm thinking. You're the designer. Hopefully that's...
No pressure there. Well, I mean, it's such an important thing, and likely, obviously, where we should be starting to think about designing any type of session and thinking how long they should be. And I know many people might not have a choice about how long the session is or how many people are actually attending. But this information, whether it's decreed for you or you have a choice about it, it still makes a massive difference as to what you deal with and how you do things.
Okay, so in which case, what's the first thing to consider, with that, whether you can choose or not choose the length of your session? Okay,
so I'm going to assume at this point people know the platform they're on, Zoom, Adobe Connect, WebEx, whatever, because that's kind of the first thing for me. But once you've got that bit, I think when you're designing your sessions, it's how many attendees you're going to have is the first consideration, as it has pretty much the biggest impact, maybe even more so than the type of content that you're delivering or facilitating.
Wow, okay, so this is literally saying, if you've got 10 people, 30 people, 300 people or more in your class, obviously it's going to have a massive change on the way you run your session.
Absolutely. And live online, you obviously need to think about the technology, just like you think about different things face to face.
I always like to have I can't remember which way I say it, that you have a go at me or not have a go at me. Physical classroom, is that the one that you have a go at me? Or?
No, you're all right with physical classroom. I think when people say real classroom, I have an issue. So physical classroom.
So in your real physical classroom.
No!
In your physical classroom, if you've got 300 attendees, you wouldn't say to them, right, everyone come up to the front of the class, you write on the whiteboard, because it would be a nightmare, and you'd have the exact same design consideration virtually.
Absolutely. And a good solution for the virtual classroom is potentially a good solution for 300 people that you have in a face-to-face session. So like you say, on a whiteboard, it's going to get out of hand very quickly. possibly cause a bit of lag, slowing down the software, and some people might not see the things on the whiteboard and all sorts of stuff. But the chat window, and especially private chat where they message each other individually, depending on the platform, that could be quick and easy to do, and much easier than 300 people getting off their seats and going to the whiteboard.
And actually, that's a really good example because, how many conferences and lectures and classrooms have we been in where the facilitator says turn to the person on your left or turn to the person on your right and have a discussion. It's exactly the same thing, just you do it virtually. Back to this point about classroom size. I guess I want to challenge you here because we hear a lot from people and they might say something along the lines of they've got 100 attendees in their session, can this be done virtually? But also it's that question mark of normally they have 300 attendees in their session and that works really well face-to-face. Like with our person with 100 attendees, they know it works face-to-face. But now they've listened to your podcast or they've been on one of your webinars where you're saying to them they need interaction every 3 to 5 minutes. And now they're thinking, well, this just isn't going to work. I can't now do this with that number of attendees.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. Now, firstly, just because you have 100, 200, 300 people or more in any of your sessions, whether it's face-to-face or not, they can still be engaging. They can still achieve that learning point that's been set out. We've all attended amazing lectures, like we said earlier on. They're engaging, they're story-driven. The facilitator took questions, and they got the pulse of the attendees and adapted to that audience. And it's tempting to say that a session with 300 attendees can't have interaction. But in either setting, digital or physical, obviously it can. I do recommend you have interaction often throughout your sessions, and you should do this no matter the number of attendees. That doesn't matter, quite frankly.
And I guess this is where you normally say in these podcasts that if you don't get any interaction, then you might as well just record a video.
Yeah, pretty much. I attended a webinar this morning and it was quite interesting, the different people giving different perspectives on a particular topic, but there was no open chat window. So a couple of us, probably 4 of us, went to Twitter and had a conversation, and that's what kept me engaged in the conversation. But if you're not going to have that chat window, why not record the videos of those speakers and quite frankly do a better job than the live webinar so that we can take that in and use that in a different way? Yeah,
for sure. That's a really good point about you had to go to an external platform to still stay engaged in the session. And, you're saying that no matter how many attendees you've got, you can still get that interaction.
Yeah, it will be different. 10 attendees, 1,000 attendees, very, very different end of the scale. But you can still have meaningful interaction. You can still read your audience, but you just use different tools to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes me think that, you ran a webinar this year which had 500 attendees, and we were in Adobe Connect, and you managed to get multiple chat windows up on the screen. You got people interacting still quite often as we went through. And yes, we had to manage it. You got 500 people using 2 or 3 chat windows. You can't obviously read through all of that. We had to cherry pick certain things, and I was producing the session, but we still got that interaction, didn't we?
Absolutely. And I think what people are finding right now is this kind of scenario. Their usual all-day training session, their courses or single shorter sessions, when delivered face-to-face, always got great feedback from the attendees. And we know it's kind of level 1, happy sheets, but they still got that great feedback. They got value for money for the individual and the organisation. And a lot of people had evidence to say it impacted the work that people did. But now, with a quick conversion to virtual classrooms, that feedback has gone down and people aren't learning quite as much.
Yeah, and this is for sure. We've had quite a few sort of chats with potential clients recently, and we always say, what is it you want? Whatever learning intervention we put in, what's your end goal? Why have you come?
What does success look like for you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and also, why have you come to us today? Why are we having this conversation? And probably in the last maybe 10 we've had, I would say at least 4 or 5 of those have literally said, yeah, we got really good feedback on our courses, and now it's not terrible feedback, but it's not at the level that we had before.
It used to be 9 or 10 out of 10. It's now 4 or 5 out of 10, and that's not good enough.
A lot of these, whether it's the people at the top or, the L&D managers, or whoever it is, they sit there and they kind of look at the session and go, well, I guess the session is just too long, or the technology is a barrier. And they kind of use that as a one-stop shop of, that's why we've got this poor feedback.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, obviously, I disagree. And sometimes it can be those things. In some circumstances, the technology is a barrier, or the session is too long. That can be true. Largely, though, it's much more about the design of the session and the competence and confidence of the facilitator. I've been reading all sorts of research recently about this, and whilst I don't have a link to this, it's something I heard on a discussion somewhere, that somebody had said their face-to-face training had really good learning retention, but their online conversion of that, the learning retention has gone down. Now, that's literally what I overheard. I don't have any more evidence of that. I have a million questions for that person. But the point is, what I heard them say was, online learning isn't as good. Whereas if you've got great design, a great virtual classroom or webinar platform, and pretty much any length of time, as long as you do it well, as long as it's designed and facilitated, then there's no reason why it can't be as good as face-to-face, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess herein lies the challenge. We've started this part of the discussion about the number of attendees in a session, but I think maybe we need to take a detour and actually explain some of the basic interactions in a session that could be used in varying degrees, no matter the number of attendees, and why we have those interactions in the first place.
Okay, so let's do what you often do, Mike, and take a physical classroom example and then equate this to a digital experience. You are the facilitator, and in your class of however many people, with the content you have, there will be parts where you provide theory or you talk at attendees in its neutral sense. You do this, but what you're doing at that time is you are looking around the room at the faces of your audience and their body language. You're gauging their reaction. And it's this sixth sense that we have and develop as trainers over the years, that you instinctively know if someone is understanding you or agreeing or not sure. And you pick up on people fidgeting who are bored, and you adapt your delivery to this. Live online, you likely can't see the attendees. Even if they're all on webcam, it's going to be hard to see them past a handful of attendees, maybe. Maybe you can only see their face, maybe their tiny thumbnails on your screen, whatever. You need to design in interaction points, no matter how many attendees there are, so that you can check in with them.
It's that needing to get those digital equivalents of scanning the room, getting a feel for what the attendees are feeling and thinking. This is what you're talking about now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this interaction doesn't have to be massively disruptive. It could be, in the chat window, let me know if you have a question or a comment. Or green tick or check mark if you agree with this statement that maybe have on a slide or that you say. You could use your arrow tool or a stamp tool to mark on the whiteboard the statement you agree with, and about a million other different interaction ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and this is what we always talk about. You start to build up a picture of where the attendees are at, where you might need to focus more time on in your session or whatnot.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is no matter whether you have 10, 30 or 300 people. It's still important for us to do this. If in your face-to-face session, you feel you know how the attendees are taking in content or are following or how they do on their activities, you're encouraging them to ask questions and make comments, you need to do the same live online if you can.
And I think this, again, is where maybe there's a divide in the thinking amongst people who need to start doing this live online learning and facilitating it. Because it seems like a lot of people seem to focus on the need for all of this interaction. So, the primary reason that they're doing this is to stop the attendee being distracted by their emails or the student going on their phone, for example. But really what you're saying here is, on a fundamental level, when it comes to facilitation or being a great teacher, teacher, you need these interaction points to help you just support the learning objective for what you're doing. That's why you're constantly scanning the room and gauging the pulse in a physical classroom, and that's why you should do it in a live online one as well.
For sure, Mike. Again, it comes down initially to thinking along the lines of what makes my face-to-face sessions great? What do I do that makes the attendees engage or understand the learning point or follow the session? How am I creating that learning environment and the opportunity for them to learn and to show that learning? And when we really reflect on this, it comes down not just to great slides, not to a well-written script and so on, but to the connection that you build and that you gain with those people on your session. That, as I said earlier on, that sixth sense that you have as a facilitator to know when you need to repeat something or when you need to slow down or speed up. Live online is exactly the same. We need to make sure we allow ourselves to do this and to gain that digital sixth sense. There you go. I'm going to hashtag that. Hashtag digital sixth sense.
But I think that is an amazing point there. It's about using, your great facilitation and teacher skills and still managing to equate that and sort of drag it onto live online.
Yeah.
To get that feedback from your attendees, to use your own, sixth sense or special skills that you have. And I think, going back to what we said about, potentially a lot of people were in this position where their feedback scores or, whatever it is, for attendees after they've done a session are starting to come back with lower scores. It's probably because somewhere they've in translation from the physical classroom to the digital classroom, they've lost some of that of what you've just spoken about.
And I mean, this is what I call digital body language. And I think it's really important, and a lot of the nuance here is missed, and completely understandably, because going live online or any kind of remote and online kind of blend, if you like, or flipped classroom approach, it takes a lot of effort, and you've got to learn the tech, and you've got to record a video, and you've blah, blah, blah. It all takes some time. And when you're concentrating on all of that, that makes sense. But when we're looking at trying to do as good a job as we do face-to-face, it's about the human connection. Whether somebody's on webcam or not, whether we've got 300 people or 3 people, we've got to work out ways to convert the nuance and the magic that we have in our facilitation skills and use the new tools to achieve that.
Exactly, Joe. And I guess this takes us back to, what we're talking about, this design of a session, and it doesn't matter whether it's a 30-minute session, all-day session, a whole morning session. You need to consider the interaction and understanding the attendee first. And that's why we've just backtracked to this interaction and why it's so important.
Absolutely. And the only difference is going to be how long it takes to design, how long it takes to practice to get it right. But effectively, you should be having the same design considerations face-to-face and live online.
And this is why you say the first design consideration is actually how many attendees you have, not how long the session is.
Yeah, I think so. And it's normally where I start, at least. A longer session, you might need to consider more breaks or longer breaks, more reflection points, different types of social learning activities, and all sorts of things. But the design of those activities will change a lot depending on the amount of attendees you expect to have in the session.
Okay, so in which case, talk us through your sort of initial design considerations when you're thinking about the different types of group sizes that you're going to have.
Okay, well, a general idea from my thinking, obviously your organisation might differ and the approach and your own skills and confidence and the technology platform as well, it might impact some of what I suggest. Something that helps me visualise how the number of attendees will impact the session and my facilitation is the chat window. I love to use the chat window. I recommend it. I do love to use the chat window. I recommend other people do as well, despite Mike laughing at me. But if I think about a session with 10 attendees, I think, the chat window will be fine for me to manage on my own. With 30 people, maybe I'm still okay because I'm quite experienced at this virtual facilitation stuff, been doing it a while. But someone else might have a different level experience. So that awareness is really important. But then when we get to maybe 100 attendees, I might be thinking, I definitely need you there, Mike, to help me manage that chat, handle the technical issues. And if we get to like 200 plus, well, maybe we need an additional producer or maybe like a chat moderator or whatever label you want to use to help manage those attendees, and to have people answering questions maybe or whatever.
And so how is it this sort of really starts helping you with those design considerations and activities for interactions when you actually get into the, the nitty-gritty of the session?
Okay, so what I'm thinking with regards to the chat and the number of attendees, this is about that mindset of the design session. So if I have so many attendees that I can't hope to keep up with the chat, that likely means I need to think about a few things. Firstly, support from a producer, co-host, chat moderator, whatever. That I won't be able to get a great individual connection with specific attendees because we've got a lot of people, it's going to be more of a group feel. Whiteboards, for instance, they will need to be really simple, perhaps one-word answers or using the stamp tools, if you can run them at all, depending on your platform. Also, I won't be able to, or perhaps very rarely, get attendees on the microphones if there's that many people. It will really depend on your session, but maybe less so. And with interaction points, they'll likely take longer. So actually, I need to have less content to cover because it would just take longer to go through all of those responses.
And as you say, it might well be different within your organisation, and some of these considerations could be mitigated or worsened depending on the type of session and facilitators you have and platform, I guess.
Yeah, but it gives you a mindset to start off with. So I know some of our higher education clients that we've worked with, they are having 300 or 400 people in the session, but they are getting people on the microphones to speak. But for other people, they'll have 30 people on a webinar and not have the microphones open. So it really does depend.
And from here, you've got that mindset using, your example of the chat window. And from here, you then, I guess, kind of start deciding, right, well, I know that I've got the mindset of I'm in a smaller, more intimate virtual classroom, or actually I'm in a larger webinar style session with more people. And then you can start selecting what kind of activities and interactions you want to do from there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I have the knowledge of running hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of varying activities. Actually, it's probably more like hundreds, just on different ways, with different types of groups and sizes to realise what can work well and what might not work well.
And that's a good point that you've made there. That, maybe you've run thousands of activities, but actually we're talking hundreds of an activity done, varied and done in different ways. So that's one thing definitely we always say start with the basics and then vary it, get used to the technology. And for our listeners who are perhaps new to this and, they don't have that thought process like you have of all of these inbuilt activities and things in their head, how is it going to work with the number of attendees that you're expecting, such as asking people to write a whole sentence in the chat about something might not work if you've got 100 plus attendees and you can't read through them all. It's going to be too much text in the chat window, but it could work great with 10. How do you start getting them in that mindset of how this is going to work?
Yeah. Really great point. And technology is that big factor, Mike. But again, we want to use it as an enabler, not a barrier. And a learning intervention is all about that. It's obviously the learning. So we don't want to get too hung up on the technology as the starting point, and think about what we want to achieve and how to do this as our in our professional teaching or facilitation life. So that example about maybe 10 attendees typing a sentence or 100 plus attendees typing, what we need to ask ourselves is, why do we want to include that at all? Not just interaction for the sake of it. So presumably it's about getting the attendee to think about something for themselves or communicate to us if they understand, a particular learning theory or point that we've just covered. And after deciding if this is the right tactic to achieve our overall learning point, then we should consider how to implement this.
And that planning and design around the implementation is a design thought that would happen in the face-to-face environment also.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it definitely should be. So face to face with 10 learners, you might ask each person to speak, for 30 seconds or a minute, or explain how they feel about topic X or whatever. With 100 learners, you might ask for one-word comments, or yes or no, or raise your hand, or that kind of talk to the person next to you and summarise your table or whatever.
And actually, that's a really good point to have made, because virtually, in any of the sort of the major good platforms which have a lot of tools and things that you can use, you can obviously do everything you've just said. Turn to the person to your left, raise your hand, agree, disagree. It's about starting with the learning point you want to achieve and then factoring in the platform technology afterwards for how you achieve that, like you say, enable that learning point.
Yeah. And there's loads of people that have done loads of great writing about that. And it takes the emphasis off of the technology being the number one consideration. And instead, it's about the attendees, their learning points, and crucially, obviously, what they need to do at work, for instance. And that should be the emphasis for your design. And then thinking about, well, what can we do in the tech?
I absolutely love that. But I do want to challenge you again on a few points.
Oh, my God. You don't give me an easy ride on these sessions.
Well,
okay.
The thing is, I think in my capacity as a producer, it's really interesting because I've always got my head in the chat window. And I often see these challenging questions come on, which I then love to then copy and paste to you, but you have to get to. But I think that's one of the things. I see a lot of this. I get a lot of emails come through about these things. And, firstly, the thing I want to challenge you on here is, what if you can't achieve what you want using the technology you have in your platform? Such as, for example, a lot of people right now want to be doing breakout rooms, but they're using Teams and they can't seem to do that. Because that's a valid thing that people are saying to us right now.
Absolutely. And there can be a point where you just can't run an activity that you want to live online in the same way. Whether that's because the platform simply won't do it, like breakouts in Teams at the moment. There is a workaround with channels, but it doesn't work for everyone. And breakout rooms are coming soon for Teams. It could be firewall restrictions. It could be third-party apps that you can't use. I like Jamboard. Julie Dryber introduced me to that, but you have to have a Gmail account for that to work. So all of these different things can give you great functionality, but for one reason or another, they might not be appropriate or even allowed in the session that you're doing. They're valid concerns. But again, going back to this real world example, if in your physical room, how many times as trainers have we turned up and the projector is broken, or we can't find the remote control for it and it's 20 feet in the air? I've never had a blackboard or a whiteboard fall off the wall, but we've had pens missing. You have to use your skills as a teacher and a facilitator to adapt to something else. I've certainly turned up at places and expect flip charts and there's been no paper. Whatever it is, it's still about adapting in the moment and focusing on what the learning point is. And online, you do exactly the same. We just have to learn the different ways of adapting to it.
And the point here is there's so much you can do in the platform that you have, variations of the tools, whatever it is that you can do to get interaction and engagement. And the point is, like you say, it's using that, but focusing on the learning point.
Yeah, and going back to that point you said earlier on about, focus on the simple stuff, the lower end of the technology scale and build up from there. We ran a webinar recently and our client used a platform where there was only chat. There was no polls, there was no green tick, thumbs up or anything like that. And we actually got business off the back of it because somebody had attended that webinar and contacted us and said, wow, we've got a platform with all these options and yet your webinar on a platform with one interaction option actually was better than most of the webinars we kind of deliver. It was more interactive. So you can use one tool, but be creative and you can still be really interactive. Now, you said you had a second point, though.
I did. And it's something we've touched upon a little bit in previous podcasts. And I think it's worth mentioning now, for those people who haven't listened to those previous podcasts. And many facilitators are in the situation, especially right now, whether you're in higher education or further education, where they just don't know the number of attendees that are going to be coming on their sessions.
Yeah.
We were talking with a client and we were providing some training, and we said to the attendees, we said, how many participants are you expecting to have in your sessions? And some people were literally putting in 40 to 250. And they just went, I don't know how many people are going to turn up on the day. That's a huge variation, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, and designing your session for 40 people or 250 people, they're very different things. And we have this on our training sessions, certainly on our webinars, sometimes on our corporate training. Thankfully, not that much variation, which is really good. But this is another thing to factor into the design. I mean, this isn't design 101. This isn't the basics. This is stepping it up a gear. But it's about having backup activities or deciding to use which activity is the most relevant for the number of people.
So in layman terms, these would be two activities with the same learning objective or outcome in mind, but they potentially use different parts of the platform, different technology, or even maybe the same tool, but just used in a different way, is what we're talking about.
Yeah, so we do this on a webinar that we run where we don't know if it's going to be the 10 attendees or the 50 or 100 attendees. And one version of the activities is everybody answer the question on the whiteboard, use the text tool, let's brainstorm some ideas. And also I have a slide with a question, so it's a slightly fuller question on it. It's like a bigger question on the slide. But what I actually do is I direct everybody to answer in the chat window for a short answer. So this way, we've got a smaller group has the whiteboard, a larger group has the chat window, and I have those slides next to each other in my PowerPoint deck, and I choose which of those slides I want to use depending on the group size.
And we've also done it where we've still used a whiteboard, but maybe we direct attendees to respond with just 1 or 2 word answers, or just use the stamp tool, for example. But effectively, It's the same learning point.
Yeah. So what we might have with less learners is we say, write an answer on the whiteboard. So we've got their language and we respond to what they've written. Or I might have a second slide which has got, 5 answers on it. Use your stamp tools to vote for the one that most closely to what you think, and then you sort of say add anything else extra in the chat window. So you're getting the overflow comments, not all the comments in the chat window. It makes things easier to manage, but it's the same basic point. People still have to think about their answer and do something.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess we can also think about this as you can kind of design neutrally, can't you? Using lots of polls or agree, disagree, which can then be used whether you've got a large group or a smaller group. Mm-hmm. And I guess maybe it's slightly more advanced, being able to adapt within the session. That's something that you would do. Often we were having a facilitator guide and maybe we weren't quite expecting so many attendees, but then you will sort of direct them to chat, or if we've got less attendees, you'll then follow up with, let's get somebody on the microphone, but maybe that's something a bit more advanced.
Well, it is and it isn't. So in terms of people's teaching and training or facilitation skill, that's something we're able to do. If you've had more than a year or so's experience facilitating in whatever you do, you're probably comfortable with that level of adaptation and that flex. But the challenge is, how do you do that live online in the moment and make sure that if you ask a question, you're asking it with the right language to say green tick if or green check mark if, and then unmute if, and just staging that correctly. And I think that's why often when we're at the basics, we say, plan it and try not to deviate too much. So it is more advanced, but only in terms of getting comfortable and experience to do it. In terms of training and teaching skill, it's part of what people are doing.
And I think actually you've just made a really interesting point now that I think about it, because with what we've said earlier about that necessity to get the interaction so that you can then sort of, use your own facilitation skills and adapt to the attendees you've got and things. Mm-hmm. That's also why it's so important, because with what you've just said about being able to adapt, you're only going to be able to do that if you've got that interaction anyway from them. So then, you've got that level of interaction, and then that's where you can then adapt and go, oh, actually, they all really understand this theory point, I'm going to move on. And then you go, oh, actually, some of them are struggling. Now I use that facilitation skill, and hopefully I feel comfortable with the platform that I can direct attendees, like you say. And then I can actually say to them, right, now I want to discuss this further in the chat window, because you're using that sixth sense, as you've said, but you just adapted it to the virtual classroom.
Yep, and that's what digital body language is all about.
Some great tips and thoughts there, Joe. Really loved that conversation there. And let's continue that as we go into kind of a summary and bring all of this podcast together. Because one of the things is, we basically primarily run 2-hour sessions, don't we, for our virtual classrooms?
Yeah, that's mainly what we aim for. We have some shorter sessions. We have some longer sessions. We have done some much longer sessions based on the requirements of the client, if that's the right thing for them, but mostly 2-hour training sessions.
And why is it, why do you feel that 2 hours is right? Why does it seem to work for what we do?
Yeah, and it is very much for what we do. The majority of the feedback we get is that 2 hours has just flown by, which is always really nice. And with 2 hours, I feel that you can get a really good amount of the theory bit. I'm not kind of heavy on delivery. Well, I kind of am, but... you can get a good bit of theory in there, but couple that with social learning, with activities to back it up, before too much fatigue from our attendees, and being honest, from me as well, kicks in. And maybe I should factor you into it.
No, don't factor me in, Joe. That's fine. And I think also something we need to consider, though, is that, we provide, I guess we do provide a fair amount of single session training offerings, which are still 2 hours. But we also have quite a few courses, which then vary between 4 and 6 sessions. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, 2 hours is okay, because then, we know we're going to do 2 hours 4 or 6 times over 2 or 3 weeks. We haven't needed to convert what we a traditional all-day training session into this kind of format, have we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. So everything we have designed specifically for live online learning from the very beginning. And this way of working has developed into our learning offering and obviously our business model. And that could be different for a trainer who usually is about gathering people together for a day of training. That adaptation is going to be different for the trainer and for the business as well, perhaps.
Yeah, so there's definitely different considerations you have to think about. And I will say that also that 2 hours can fly by, especially when we have lots of practical activities. And we like to get our attendees hands-on, especially in our courses, let them grab the reins. And I think that can really help out mix up the session. You get those practical points. It can feel like a different element, especially, if you as the attendee have spent, 3 or 4 minutes doing something, that could be sort of make a session really fly by, can't it?
Well, especially when we say you've got 1 minute to do this and it takes 4 minutes, because the time disappears so quickly, especially in those circumstances.
But being honest also, some of our modules or standalone sessions, where it is just a single session, you've got 2 hours, we've got to have a bit more theory to get through. We don't have all those other different sessions that we can start building up on those theory points. And potentially, we have seen fatigue kick in with some of our attendees every now and then.
Don't say that on this podcast, Mike.
But it's true, it is true, isn't it?
No, you're right. You're right. And this is the constant iteration that certainly we go through after each session we run. And as good trainers and facilitators, if we're given the time to do it, everybody really wants to do probably. And we identify perhaps actually that theory point needs to be in a different part of the session. Maybe it's part of pre-work, because again, this isn't just about the live online session. This is about the whole blend. And that maybe, that more flipped classroom approach of here's some pre-work that we then discuss rather than me teaching you. And that social learning aspect then is stronger. It's a huge balance to have when you're designing your sessions based on what your clients might actually do.
And exactly like you say, we literally review after every single session we run, sort of what has gone on with that session, and some things we just know straight away. We go, yeah, actually, we've done that question 3 times now, we need to change it, or whatever it is. And other points we think, let's see how the next group finds that before we make a decision. It's that, like you say, constant iteration.
Yeah, it's really valid. And sometimes, and this is the difference between individuals and getting to know a group. You get a group that's really engaging, everything works, and quite frankly, you think it was an amazing session. And
if you say so yourself.
Wow! Part of this is about what we feel and our reaction. But then you run the same session and the conversation goes in a different direction. The attendees are just interacting differently, maybe kind of less overall. And this is the joy, is that each session is different, but also then the feedback on each question or activity is different.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, recently, within the last couple of months, we've worked with 3 different organisations where English has not been the first language for most of the attendees. And we got some feedback from some of the sessions that potentially 2 hours was just too long in length for them.
Yeah. And this is where we need to think about your organisation and your attendees, because that's something that, translating that the whole time makes it tiring. For further and higher education, maybe you need shorter sessions. I was looking at some interesting data the other day from the Suddenly Online report. It's a national survey of undergraduates during COVID-19. And it was really interesting data from HE and FE establishments, and this one was particularly from students of those establishments. The feedback was broken down into class sizes pre and during COVID-19. With face-to-face sessions, larger classes of attendees still got really high feedback scores. But during COVID, with more or in some cases, all of the sessions being virtual, the larger classes feedback dropped a fair amount, showing less satisfaction. The way I'm reading it is that sessions with fewer people had higher satisfaction, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, and that is really interesting, actually, especially like you say, you have to think about within your organisation. And that's why we said right at the start of this podcast, there is no silver bullet for all of this. You have to think about how this is going to work, because exactly like you say, maybe younger students compared to more adult learners, or maybe in a work setting or corporate setting, are going to respond differently to class size or session length. And I like actually that you've made the point there. It's not that younger students will do this better or are more able to do this or more used to it, because there's no research that I know of to say that's the case. But certainly different types of people in different organisations will respond differently. Yeah, and I think it's, also you've got the social, geographical, cultural aspects as well. If the region that you're training, you're delivering in are used to 10-hour work days and all-day training sessions, then, potentially you need to adapt to that. But if they're not, you need to adapt to that as well, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. We've found organisations we've trained that have clients or attendees they deliver to in Asia, for instance, and they can find it really hard to get interaction. One of the reasons for that is there's a lot more respect and authority from a teacher, or for a teacher, I should say. So, but then often they're happier with 4-hour plus training sessions. So there's all sorts of different ways you can slice and dice this.
Yeah, I feel like we're really not helping our listeners here.
I feel like maybe we gave them the answer, then took it away. But no, it's about, your learners, your organisation, your team, your region, your geography, whatever it is. And therefore, you have the answers to this. And this is about taking everything you know already and layering the digital skills, not throwing it all away and starting again.
I like that. That would seem like quite a poignant thing of you have the answer within yourself.
Well, we could go down the psychology route, Michael, but I think that's a whole other podcast at this point.
But I think this goes back to a point I made earlier. Maybe it was, in hindsight, I think it was a little bit combative when I said it, about that.
Surely not.
Yeah, but about that, you have to really be honest with yourself as a facilitator within your organization and really ask yourself, I think we were talking about the all-day training session. Can we design a great session for the length of session we want? How will our attendees cope and manage with it? And, like you say, you've got the answer within yourself. If you can actually look at that and go, actually, the culture in our organization is just not going to work that way. We have to do something different. Or our designers, don't have the knowledge or whatever it is. That way, if you have that bit of honesty, you can sit there and go, right, well, we need to pivot. 90-minute sessions, 30-minute sessions, whatever it's going to be. Yeah. You have the answer somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if you don't have the answer, it might be you know enough to ask the question. And then it's about researching and speaking to people and going, what are the potential answers? Is it the shorter live online sessions? How do we mix up videos and e-learning and, whatever else is appropriate to what you need in your organisation?
Yeah, and that's the whole point about the podcast we've done today, because you have to go over these design considerations because there's so much time and effort involved in it.
So it's important to have those considerations because there's no point spending hours and hours designing and then delivering something if it's not the right fit for that team, that organisation, whatever. So it's about getting it right. And some of it might be getting it wrong in order to be on the journey to get it right. But the point is, if it shouldn't be a live online session, do it something else. If it shouldn't be e-learning and you need to have discussion, do it as live online, and so on.
I think that's actually a really good point, and I think probably is a great summary for this whole podcast of what you've just said there. There's no point of spending the time, we've said 8 hours for every 1 hour of live online delivery. There's no point of doing all of this if you haven't asked yourself those questions. How is it going to work within your organisation? How is it going to work with the attendees? So I think you've just done an amazing summary at the end there. That's really good.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. What's to discuss next?
No, I think that's literally it. I think that's...
Oh, right, okay.
I was trying to say, you've done the summary, that's the podcast over.
I just enjoy these podcasts with you, Mike, so much. That's all it is.
I think definitely when it comes to design, I think we've probably got 20, 30, 40, 50 more design podcasts in the future because it's such an important and huge topic right now. Yeah. Loads of people are having these conundrums, and so we will definitely do more on design, but we've just done a really long podcast, so thank you so much, Jo. Really interesting conversation with you today.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody who's listening. Thank you for listening. We really hope you enjoyed it and look forward to your feedback and your comments. If you like the podcast, please remember to subscribe and to share. You can follow Mike on Twitter @MikeLightBulb. You can follow me on Twitter @LightBulbJo, and for other updates @MomentLightBulb. You can also find our podcasts on YouTube, along with more great content. If you're in need of virtual classroom training, check out lightbulbmoment.online. For our blogs, lightbulbmoment.info. And remember our free community for questions and resources, lightbulbmoment.community.